excellence in communications of religious faith and values while advancing religious literacy. So our monthly webinars are one of the opportunities to cultivate excellence and have an educational opportunity. We'll select another individual. So I already told you I am the president of the Religion Communicators Council. I am in transition from a career standpoint, moving from United Methodist Communications to currently being a freelance consultant. I'm a market research person, and I currently reside in Dayton, Ohio. I am going to hand it off to Ryan.
Good morning. My name is Ryan Coe. I am the director of the New York Office of Public and International Affairs for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You can see 57th behind me. And I'm currently serving as the vice president of the RCC. And I'll give it to Brad.
My name is Brad Pomerantz. I am an executive vice president at Jewish Life Television. We're a national basic cable television network. And I work with Brian and the gang on our awards for secular media that are covering issues of religion and faith. I'll send it to my buddy, Reverend Brian.
Well, hello, everybody. I think everybody here knows me except maybe Jennifer. Hello, I'm Brian Fessler. I pastor the Scientology Church in Nashville, Tennessee, and been with RCC since 2010. Currently the treasurer of the board, and like Brad said, we coordinate the awards programs for RCC. I will pass it off to Father Jim. It's so good to have you on the call.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, thank you. Jim Gardner. I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm currently in a nursing home recuperating from open heart surgery. I've been here 8 months, but my day job, I'm the director of special projects at the Franciscan Monastery of the Holy Land here in D.C.
And the board member of RCC.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Jenny, do you want to say a couple comments real quick?
Sure. Jenny Heiser, I'm an executive director for RCC. And Jennifer, thanks for joining us today. I get to work with all these good folks and do some of the background stuff. So communicator at heart, and certainly hope to live out my faith. So thank you so much for joining us. Looking forward to your comments.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, and Jennifer, that's who we are. I am going to speak a little bit about who Jennifer is. And I connected with her through Scott Thuma, who is with Faith Communities Today. So all these wonderful people that you network with help pull all these things together. It's definitely a group effort. So Jennifer is our speaker today. She is a sociologist of religion whose work focuses on churches, synagogues, and other local congregations. She received her PhD in sociology from Penn State University. Her professional interests include religious congregations, prosocial behavior, like volunteering and charitable giving, social psychology, social networks, and statistics. She teaches courses that integrate social scientific insights with ministry preparation. And all of this sounds really fascinating. She's going to share from her book today. It is titled, No Congregation is an Island, How Faith Communities Navigate Opportunities and Challenges Together. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer. And again, I appreciate that everybody introduced themselves because that helps us know. Let's see, do we have somebody new? Jay, your timing is perfect. Introduce yourself, please. After, I'll keep talking while you chew. And we all introduced ourselves. I did a quick introduction, but Jennifer hasn't started yet. So tell her about you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Jennifer. My name is Jay Rollins. I'm coming to you from St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. and I have been a member of RCC and past national president for, God, 15, 16, 17 years now. I don't want to admit that I'm that old, but thank you for doing this today.
Thank you, Jay. All right, Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you. Here we go. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen and use a PowerPoint as we go. And I'll share a little bit of background about this and a little bit more background about me. I'm a fellow Ohioan, Teresa. I grew up in Lima, about an hour north of Dayton. Yeah. And now I'm in Birmingham, Alabama. And today I'm going to tell you about my book, No Congregation is an Island: How Faith Communities Navigate Opportunities and Challenges Together. Some of the motivation behind this book is I really enjoy thinking about relationships. And a lot of times when we think about relationships in congregational life, we think about relationships within congregations, maybe between clergy and members or among members or something like that. But we sometimes don't think as much about relationships between congregations, but those are just as important. And in this book, I'm going to focus on why they're important, particularly around opportunities and challenges. As you all are aware, congregations and faith communities have encountered a lot of challenges in recent years, declining membership in some groups, conflict, maybe difficulty reaching young adults, or the political polarization in our context, or certainly the pandemic. And one of my thoughts is that like local churches and congregations are not designed to do this alone, and that local congregations need each other in navigating that. So in where I got the title for this book, I start with a quote from Thomas Merton that talks about how, like from a Christian theological perspective, how we are intimately tied together. We can't just be islands on our own. That we are, whether we're aware of it or not, we're part of a larger network, and that we're not just individual islands who are disconnected. And I think many of us learned this one way or another during the pandemic. I'm married now, but when the pandemic started, I was single and living alone. And I used my phone a whole lot to call my family, to call friends, to call the guy who's now my husband. And I think even though I was single and I lived alone, I've definitely learned that I couldn't be an island, and I needed to nurture relationships with people around me. So I have a number of reasons why I think relationships matter for congregations. They matter because congregations are facing lots of different challenges and opportunities. There's declining religiosity across the US. Some religious groups are declining more quickly than others, but more religious groups are declining than are growing. And so that's a reality that many are having to face. Many faith groups are struggling with reaching young adults. When you look at the average age of attenders, it is getting faster more rapidly than the average American is getting older. And so because of the baby boomers, and the baby boomers are getting older, Americans on average are older than they used to be. But attenders are growing older more quickly on average than your average American. There are also challenges related to congregation size. I'm thinking about some research from Scott Thumma and then also from Duke with the National Congregation Study. And I think I'm going to quote the Duke data here because I'm more familiar with it. At least 40% of congregations in the US have 50 people or less on an average weekend. That's small. And a lot of times I think, and when I talk to my students about this, they're shocked because many of them have gone to a mega church with a friend, or maybe their family goes to a mega church, or they assume that more churches are big because those are the churches that for them are visible. But most congregations are small. But we're seeing more and more attenders being concentrated into the very largest congregations. So there's a bit of a tension with lots of smaller congregations, but more and more attenders are ending up in the very largest congregations. Many congregations have faced neighborhood disconnection. Maybe when the congregation was founded, the people at the congregation had relationships with the people in the neighborhood or possibly lived in the neighborhood, but over time, many neighborhoods have changed. And so maybe the people who attend services don't know or demographically match the people in the surrounding neighborhood. And that can be a disconnect because many congregations feel a calling to serve in their local community and serve around, if they have a building, around their building, but may not feel like they have the connections that they need to do that. We are seeing growing polarization in the US, politically and culturally. And all 5 of these top challenges and opportunities were happening well before COVID. And then we saw it get amplified during COVID about, does your congregation require masks or not? Suddenly the polarization in many ways became very clear because we could see how people thought about something. And COVID accelerated in some faith communities declines in attendance and things as maybe people got used to doing something else instead of going to church or synagogue or another faith community. In this book, I talk about 3 different kinds of social support that I think are important for congregations to share. And I will address each of them throughout the talk. One is emotional support. That's, I'm here for you. How are you doing? I'm so sorry this is happening. Informational support is giving information or advice or resources. Instrumental support is offering practical help, and often in this book it involved collaborations. And then in the book I look at relationships within and between religious groups, and then also within and between racial groups. Before I proceed, I'll mention that the book is based on congregations in Central Alabama. And Central Alabama is distinctive in a number of ways, but I do think the results apply more broadly than just Central Alabama for a few reasons. And the first is that research on social support, there are over 10,000 studies on social support. And research is very consistent about these different kinds of social support. And they happen in so many different kinds of relationships: marriages, friendships, between colleagues, family members. There's so many ways. So there's no reason for them not to happen between congregations. Another reason why this applies is that what is motivating my look at relationships within and between religious groups and within and between racial groups is a concept called homophily, and that's the idea that birds of a feather flock together. We tend to prefer relationships with people who are like us, but I think one of the benefits of an organization like the RCC is it builds relationships between religious groups. And but because of like birds of a feather flock together, that dynamic is so common in marriages and families and friendships and colleague relationships and all sorts of kinds of relationships. There's also no reason that it doesn't happen between congregations. And some of my previous research shows that religious and racial homophily are very common among congregations. So I'd like to start with my first network image. So in this image, each circle is a congregation, and you might notice that some lines are dark and some are light. In this diagram, the dark lines represent relationships where congregations share the same religious group, and the light lines are relationships where they do not share the same religious group. And as you can see, they're not all dark, but most of them are dark. And in the study that I did, almost 60% of the relationships were within religious groups. And this is because it's fairly convenient to develop, okay? Many of you work or like serve in a communications role in a particular faith group. And I don't know about your faith group, but when I talk with ministers, they've got too much to do and not enough time to do it. And they're often trying to look for convenient options to build relationships, because they often know that they need that support, but maybe may not have a lot of time to build those relationships. So I think relationships within religious groups are very important because in some ways they're the lowest hanging fruit. They're the easiest to develop. And some of the ministers I talked with who were very focused on building like relationships across religious groups talked about how during the pandemic, they were just trying to keep their head above water, just like the rest of us. And it was easy to just go within their religious group because many religious groups are trying to give common guidance or things about how to respond to the pandemic or minister during the pandemic. Many people just have a preference within their religious group. It's easier to collaborate. They have a shared understanding of what ministry involves. They have a shared theology or practice. They don't have to navigate what does a revival service mean for you? Who's going to do communion? They don't have to navigate their style of prayer or something like that. And it's also helpful when there's a shared organizational structure. There was a non-denominational pastor who was talking about how he kept trying to partner, there are plenty of Baptists in Birmingham, Alabama, with this Baptist church down the street. And it was hard to collaborate because as a non-denominational pastor, he could just make decisions and move forward with things. And his friend, the Baptist pastor down the street, said, well, I need to run it by this committee. I need to run it by that committee. And by the time it got run by the committee, the momentum was lost. So having a shared organizational structure helps. And this is really important because in our lives as individuals, we need trusting, encouraging friendships. That's very important for our well-being. And that is also the same for congregations. Congregations need other congregations who they trust, where they can be open about these are our opportunities, these are our challenges, we don't really quite know how to manage this. Congregations need encouragement about, you can do it, you can figure this out. We'll walk alongside you, and our congregations can figure this out together. There are benefits. It's very easy to exchange ideas and resources when there's a shared religious group, and you don't have to navigate, well, we don't actually believe that, but can we find something in this we can still use? And it's very easy to collaborate, but there are downsides. And one is that there's not as wide of a range of information and collaborations. There can be, if you will, groupthink, where everyone sort of sees similarly and shares similar information. One of the things that also came up that I was sort of surprised about is that people were talking about competition. So there's a Southern Baptist pastor in a rural community who said, you know, what's to stop, you know, someone going from another Southern Baptist church in my community that is essentially the same as ours. So if we partner with them, they're concerned about losing attenders. There was a very specific subset of type of this relationship. This is the same image you saw earlier, but you will notice that there are now some squares in an area and triangles in an area. There were a couple religious groups that were very distinctive in having relationships almost exclusively within their religious group. And in my context in Central Alabama, these were typically two Churches of Christ, the non-denominational, non-instrumental Churches of Christ, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it was interesting because they have very different polities. The Latter-day Saints have a very sort of centralized hierarchical structure, where Churches of Jesus Christ are non-denominational. There's no overarching body, very independent. But they come from similar, maybe not similar theological roots, but a similar motivation around restoration. They both have, and they're founding this idea that maybe other churches had gone astray and that the true faith needed to be restored. And in these faith groups, the support was incredibly rich. This was the richest support I found in my research. The friendships were very close. It was very easy to share information, ideas, very easy to collaborate. One of the Churches of Christ pastors that I talked with shared about how they wanted to do a joint service, and it was very easy. There's a common worship style. So-and-so's church is doing worship, so-and-so's preaching. Very easy to pull it together. One of the Church of Christ pastors I talked with gave this amazing story about how he was bivocational, so he was also working as a school principal, and he went to another city and attended a Church of Christ and just went to Sunday school and participated, and someone asked if he was a preacher just because of his knowledge of things. And he said yes, and they let him preach that Sunday, not having met him before. That's a lot of trust. One of the Latter-day Saints leaders I talked with talked about how helpful the church was in giving support and ideas during the pandemic, that there were already models that had been created that allowed for worship at home and allowed churches and families to transition relatively seamlessly when the pandemic started. There can be some disadvantages though. There's a Church of Christ I talked with that added an instrumental service, and many Churches of Christ, at least in my part of the country, have non-instrumental worship as like a point of doctrine. And in adding an instrumental worship service, they really lost their relationships with other Churches of Christ. Another Church of Christ pastor talked about how, like, I try to give someone advice and everyone knows everyone, and so now everyone knows the advice I gave them, and now everyone has an opinion on the advice I gave them. One of the Latter-day Saints leaders I talked with talked about how, because the wards within the stake in our area are so tightly connected, it can make it hard to maybe build relationships outside of the stake. This next image is the opposite of what we saw earlier. Here, the light lines are relationships within the same religious group, and the dark lines are relationships between different religious groups. And I'll probably spend some time on this one since this is an interfaith group. In my study, 43% of the relationships in the previous diagram were between religious groups. And even though these are not like as, even though these are not as convenient to develop, there are many ways that congregations develop them. Some do it through local ministerial associations where maybe around a community there are different faith groups and they all collaborate. I'm thinking of a fairly prominent ministerial association in a particular neighborhood in Birmingham that has a Reformed synagogue, a conservative synagogue, a Presbyterian church, an Episcopal church, a Greek Orthodox church, a Muslim center, and like quite a few very interfaith and partnering together. Some are just developed through informal relationships between ministers. Some of the ministers I talked with one in particular was in a small town, and he said, I don't care what faith group someone is, if there's a minister who moves into this area, I want to get to know them, I want to be their friend. Sometimes this develops between relationships between attenders, where attenders, maybe our congregations can do something. Maybe we can get our ministers together to talk. And it was very interesting between more conservative churches and more liberal congregations, what they bridged. There's always some commonality that they found, and what that was. Among some of the more conservative Southern Baptist or non-denominational or Presbyterian churches, it was a shared understanding of the gospel and what it means for people to follow Jesus, and wanting people in their communities to know that churches were united around the gospel and not letting worship styles or preaching styles or other things divide them. Where for many of the non-Christian congregations and more liberal churches, it was social justice. It was, we're willing to come around to make the community better, to address poverty. It doesn't matter that our theology is different. Some of the benefits here is that there's a lot of exchange of ideas and resources. And because these were relationships across religious groups, there's typically ideas and resources that people wouldn't be exposed to within their religious group. I don't know if y'all have had that experience in this organization. You likely have. And there were also maybe more opportunities for collaborations and more rich collaborations, because there were different ideas and resources and perspectives that could be brought to the table. One of the downsides, though, is that they were not as close. So one of the Muslim leaders I talked with said, some of the liberal churches that we have very close partnerships with, if it's about poverty or payday lending or access to healthcare or any of those kinds of things, we're 100% with them. If it comes to abortion or sexuality, we might go a different way because there's not as much of a shared perspective there. And this might just be because the study was based in Birmingham. There are not many non-Christian congregations in the area. I think there are maybe 4 Jewish congregations, just a few Muslim congregations. So many of the, at least in my study, many of the non-Christian congregations ended up in this chapter because there wasn't enough of a critical mass for them to just stay within their faith community. If they wanted to build relationships with other congregations, they really had to bridge to other faith communities. This next one has to do with race. And so here the dark lines are where congregations share the same racial composition, and the light lines are where congregations have different racial compositions. And you will see that there are some light lines, but it's quite a bit harder to notice them. There are quite a few more dark lines. And here, 70% of the relationships in my network were within racial groups. Some of this may be because I'm in Birmingham, Alabama, and there's a lot of history around racial division and inequality. But we're not the only part of the country that would have racial divisions like this. And these relationships were maybe difficult for some ministers to discuss. It was much easier to say I prefer within my religious group than to say I prefer within my racial group. So in this chapter of the book, I focus more on barriers than the benefits because these happen very easily, but they can reflect and reinforce the racial divisions in the local community, and they certainly do within Central Alabama. Identify 3 kinds of barriers. One is denominational homogeneity. Many prefer, they may not exclusively build relationships within their own religious group, but many prefer relationships within their religious group. Many religious groups are racially homogeneous, and so a relationship within the religious group is likely to have the same racial composition. Many also prefer relationships nearby. And many neighborhoods and communities are racially segregated. So, you know, partnering with a congregation in my neighborhood rather than in the next county is probably going to mean someone who's also my same racial composition. And then there are different cultural divisions that developed. Theologically, sometimes people would say, well, I prefer someone that maybe has our worship style or our preaching style or our theology, and that tended to be within the same racial group. There were some African-American congregations who said, especially after Trump was elected, I'm not sure if I feel comfortable partnering with a white church where a lot of people supported Trump if, like, we're concerned about sort of what racial dynamics Trump is going to bring into his administration. And then there were cultural differences, divisions around the pandemic. There's an African-American pastor who said, you know, our church, and this was like late 2021, we're still doing distancing and we're still requiring masks, and like COVID has hit our community hard. And it would be hard to partner with a white church in town where I'm friends with the pastor because they're acting like there's not a pandemic happening. And that's just not something I can expose my community to. One of the things that I did learn in this is that relationships within sort of the same racial composition can be a safe space for congregations of color to share ideas and resources in a way where they're less likely to encounter some kind of prejudice or discrimination from a predominantly white congregation. One of my favorite chapters in the book. Oh, and this is just to show, these are the 8 counties in the study. And this shows how racially segregated the area is. There's not a lot of gray areas. It's either very light or very dark. And so there's a lot of racial segregation in the area. This next slide has a diagram where now the dark lines are relationships between congregations with different racial compositions, and light lines are congregations, are relationships between congregations with the same racial composition. And only 30% of the relationships in that figure are between congregations with different racial compositions. But there are lots of ways to develop these relationships, even though they're not as convenient. There are some racial reconciliation or racial justice programs that intentionally bring together congregations of often different faith groups and different racial groups. One of the Jewish congregations I interviewed talked about how they have been paired with a predominantly Black Baptist church and had been doing things together, having some meals and services and service projects together that they probably would have never developed without that program. Some ministerial associations are multiracial, where everyone in a community, regardless of their race, is able to participate. Some churches and congregations specifically talked about building dialogues around race and racial dynamics in the community. And sometimes these develop through informal relationships between the ministers. And there were a lot of benefits. Some were in exchanging ideas and resources. I want to be careful on time, so I'm going to give maybe 2 examples for benefits. One, there was a predominantly white pastor of a predominantly white Presbyterian church that used a lot of language around light and dark in their liturgy, and someone raised a concern that dark was always painted negatively. And so then she reached out to a fellow Presbyterian pastor who was Black to say, you know, I got this concern. I want to take it seriously. I'm not quite sure how to respond. Will you help me think through it? And there are also really interesting collaborations where there's one where there's a African-American church in a predominantly African-American community, and they were buying up property so that they could build affordable housing, and then partnering with suburban predominantly white churches who had builders and contractors in their church who would volunteer time to come and build homes in their communities. The main downside here is they're not always easy, especially some of the African-American pastors I talked with talked about experiencing discrimination and trying to build these relationships, people treating them like they weren't smart or wise enough to be a minister, or like experiencing some ways where one of them, many of the white ministers in their area were full-time and many of the Black ministers were part-time, and the ministerial association did events when when all the Black pastors were at work, so they could never participate, and how there were some difficult things they needed to navigate. This is a chapter of the book where I give the most tips, how it takes time to build trust. We can't like force anyone to trust us right away, and to take time to make sure, like the example I just gave for the ministerial association, that there's a way for equal participation, that there's a way for mutuality where congregations that have different racial compositions are both given opportunities to contribute and serve. And it's important to understand the history of race in this country and to understand like how the racial divisions that we see have developed, and to resist like a white savior complex where there's a tendency in some circles, well, the white church just needs to come in and fix this. That is something that we've seen plenty of in Birmingham, across Birmingham's history. And many of the ministers I talked with talked about like being aware of that dynamic and actively resisting it, and not understanding that there was a pattern of typically white churches feeling like they needed to come into a community of color and fix everything, but that made everything worse. And if they wanted to actually build relationships across racial groups, they needed not to do that, and to more support their partners and communities of color rather than coming in and taking over the situation. I have a few last things, and then I look forward to our conversation and questions. In the last chapter, I talk about different ways to build relationships. In your communication positions, if you have ways to encourage ministers to build relationships, these are, and congregations to do so, these are 4 common ways. Friendships between ministers are often the easiest and very beneficial. Having joint events can build bridges beyond just the ministers to the people at the congregations. Ministerial groups are also helpful. Some religious groups have their own ministerial groups within a district or diocese or a stake or some other kind of grouping. They're often local ministerial groups that are maybe interfaith or interracial. And then some congregations have relationships where the ministers exchange pulpits or teaching opportunities. And that is also a good way to build relationships. But in the book, I conclude with 3 pieces of advice, and one is to do what you can. Many ministers are overwhelmed with what they have to do and don't have enough time to do everything that they need to do. And I don't want this book to just be like one more thing that they don't have time to do, or I don't want them to feel bad about not doing it. So I give advice to do what ministers can to make it manageable, and to nurture close friendships, because we often get the most rich support that way, and rich encouragement and opportunities to share information and collaborate. But it's important not to forget about acquaintances. Close friendships are more likely to involve a similarity, where acquaintanceships are more likely to involve a difference. And when there's a difference, we often get a wider range of information, more opportunities, and it's important not to forget about those, because we very much can benefit from them, even if we may not get the richest support from them. So that, in a nutshell, is what my book is about. And I hope it can give you maybe some ideas, especially if you're communicating within a particular religious group, to maybe help ministers think about how they can build relationships with each other and how they can build partnerships within your faith group, but also with other faith groups as well, and within their racial group, but also across racial groups as well. And I think I have seen some things popping up in the chat and some names. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have. Reverend Brian.
I was curious, you showed that chart several times with the organizations and the dark lines and the gray line.
Yes.
But the dots were all clustered the same in each chart. What did the
Yes.
clusters mean?
So that's a really good question, and that's the most common question I get to start. Typically, the question is like, are those particular religious groups? Are those geographic communities? And the answer is, if I didn't have some kind of clustering, it looks like a bowl of spaghetti, and it already looks like a bowl of spaghetti, but it would be even worse. And so I just told the computer to group it in ways that maximize relationships within groups and minimize them between groups. But the computer isn't using religious groups or geographic communities to make, or racial groups to make those. It's just a way to organize it so that there's a little bit more structure in the diagram.
So Jennifer, would it be fair to say that the computer is simply using the data that you're giving it to create the groups?
Yeah.
Okay.
The groups are not too substantive, but it's just trying to find interconnected groups as a way to emphasize where there's interconnection, where there's and where there are bridges. But I'm just using it as a way to create some kind of structure in the diagram.
Well, and we only got one view at a time, and if you could see multiples, you might be able to see, oh, now I see where there's a difference here or there, perhaps.
Yeah, and there was a point in the first way I was thinking about the book where there are chapters on different clusters, and so sort of focusing on different local communities or certain like interfaith clusters or things like that. But then that became a bit too technical and not as practical, and I wanted the book to be practical. So I switched to focusing on different kinds of relationships because that would be more like practically usable for faith communities.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Ryan?
Yeah.
So I missed part of this presentation. I had to step out for a few minutes, so maybe you addressed it already, and I apologize to everybody else if you have. But I'm curious about relationships within different congregations of the same faith group.
Yeah.
So if I have a Latter-day Saint congregation here and a Latter-day Saint congregation there, are even despite having, the same faith, are the similar factors still in play about having a relationship with the other congregations, race, politics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
So
I don't know if you factored in for the same faith groups.
There's one slide, and you can let me know if you saw it or not. That was about Latter-day Saints and Churches of Christ.
Oh, I didn't. I missed that one completely
I'll
because
bring
I
it
wasn't
back
here.
up.
So I apologize again.
It's okay. I'll share it again. Because it was a really interesting situation where there were two faith communities. Okay. One moment. Let's see. Okay, there were two different faith communities that had relationships almost exclusively within their community. Over here, on the top left, where you see squares, is Churches of Christ. Sort of top right, where you see the triangles, is Latter-day Saint wards, many of which were in the same stake. And one of the things that I noticed there is that they were willing to cross significant geographic distance and to cross racial groups very easily to build relationships within their stake. So the Churches of Christ cluster was all typically predominantly white because they tend to be rural and in predominantly white areas, but there was a lot of racial diversity within the Latter-day Saint wards, and that was not a barrier. Theology wasn't a barrier. Geographic distance, they might have been multiple counties away. That was not a barrier because it's very tight-knit within that particular stake. And I would guess that it's that tight-knit within most stakes.
And then a kind of a follow-up question. Did you do any research to like shared history of different congregations or shared live experiences? I know that you did a lot of your research from the pandemic and forward. So has there been any follow-up, like, because we went through this together, we now have a much tighter relationship than we had before, or anything like that?
So the data that supports that's behind the networks is collected in 2017 and 2018, and then the interviews were in 2021. And I did one snapshot. No one had ever done a study, published a study before on relationships between congregations. It was always relationships within congregations. And I learned why no one had done that before, because it's very time intensive. And I thought about doing like a second wave, but I think it would have been challenging because even from 2017, 2018 to 2021, there have been quite a few ministerial transitions. And I'm thinking like in some of the Latter-day Saint wards where bishops may serve for a few years and then rotate to another maybe position in the ward. Many even of the bishops that I talked with were no longer bishops a couple years later. And so it would have been hard to do a second wave with how many leadership transitions there were just within that 3 or 4 years. So yeah, I'm not looking at history. It's more of a point in time.
Well, that in and of itself is kind of fascinating because within one, let's just, and all these denominations, you talk about they all have their own lingo, they all have their own structure, that makes it easy to stay within your own group. So, but even within your own faith, it sounds like even relationships with other congregations can be challenging. And given that there's a lot of change and movement and leadership, it takes time to develop relationships. And then when leaders get pulled out or put in and all these things change, and you got to start over from scratch. I applaud you for doing all the hard work. A lot of what you said affirms what I have experienced either in research or just being present in the United Methodist Church. Even some of the what I will call silos or trust or competition, where you're like, aren't we all in this together? But we still seem to compete somehow. One thing you said toward the end, and I might be sort of trying too hard to connect the dots, but I think this is helpful. And I mentioned when I introduced myself, bye Jay. I mentioned when I introduced myself that I am in a career transition. So I've been going to some different events. And one recently was talking about how we tend to perceive difference as difficult. And perhaps, difference can just be an opportunity. It doesn't mean you have to be fast friends. It just means it doesn't always have to be difficult.
Yeah.
And then keeping in mind that, I could be the difficult. We always think that it's the other person that's different and they're difficult, when in reality, I could be their difficult, right? So anyway, do you have anything you want to say about that?
Well, and I remember when relatively recently married. My husband and I got married last summer, and like last summer. And I remember in premarital counseling, they said one of the things that stuck with me is that differences don't have to become disagreements, right? We can be aware of differences, and in many of the things where people were partnering across religious groups, they were aware that there were differences. They weren't like minimizing. They weren't saying, oh, you know, we're all essentially the same and none of the differences matter. They were acknowledging the differences, but they were also saying there's a point of commonality where we can work together. There's at least one point of commonality. And I think working across difference can be less convenient, but that doesn't have to be a problem. And it can involve some very rich benefits if people take the time and are intentional about it.
100%. I like how you said that. And I don't want to put Brian on the spot, but I had some time with him recently. And I would say that there are a lot of events in communities where different organizations want to help their community because, you know, we're all in the community. We would like the community to thrive. And I could be getting this wrong, Brian, but in essence, are there ways, you know, to have events? And I know, Brian, you do tend to get, I think, host, maybe because you're good at it, and then people ask you to do it more often, events that do cover a lot of different
Well, we try to bring a
folks.
lot of demographics together from religious, political, social, economic, race, all kinds of things. And maybe your question is along that line of like, how can we do more of that? How can we reach the people? It's easy to reach somebody, you know, that agrees with me. How do we reach people that just think you're crazy or think you're wacko and want to, you know, try to create relationships with those people too? That'd be my question.
So I have a story from the book that I think addresses that a bit, from one of the Mormon leaders or Latter-day Saint leaders I was talking with. Latter-day Saints are very good at mobilizing volunteers, and especially when there's some kind of crisis or weather event. And so I was speaking with a stake leader who was talking about how quickly they can mobilize if something happens, how quickly they can mobilize people. But he said that there were some ways that they wanted to partner with like a local Protestant church about serving in the community, and that church just sort of had reservations, maybe because of some of the theological differences or things. But there was, you know, something that came up and they were able to partner together. And that church, which is a very large church and is effective at mobilizing lots of people, said, wow, y'all were great to work with. Like, you mobilized so many people, you were great to work with, you're very friendly. They didn't really feel like any theological differences. There wasn't like any theological weirdness or differences that caused any problems during the event. And so because like the other church gave that ward a chance, now they have a relationship where they're doing something in the community, that ward is invited to participate. And so I know the stake leader was saying, you know, people just give, you know, I know like Latter-day Saints are not very common in Alabama, and there probably people have misconceptions about what they believe, but like if people will give us a chance and serve with us, they will find that we are a good partner. And
Well, maybe
Brian,
in
I didn't
essence-
have any Scientologists in my study. I'm not sure how many there are in Alabama, but
There's a few, not too many. Probably.
are you in
not a big
Alabama?
thing.
Are you in Alabama?
No, Nashville.
Nashville, yeah. But I don't know if that resonates with your experience as well, like being a smaller, more distinctive faith group.
Yeah, you just have to keep reaching out. Eventually somebody will take a chance, and then there you go.
Take a leap of faith. We are at the top of the hour, so we need to wrap it up. Is there any final remarks anyone would like? Look at the chat. Any final remarks from anyone before we close?
Thank you,
I'll just say
Jennifer.
thank you.
No,
I'm
that was
Thank you,
really
Jennifer.
fascinating.
enjoyed this.
Interesting.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed this, and I hope you all found ways that you can find it useful to your own work.
Very insightful.
Absolutely.
And if you know of ministers in your communities who need some support, please encourage them to get the book. It is literally, I don't think it's in this room. It's literally this thick because I don't want anyone to feel like they don't have time to read it. And so like page 1 to end of the last chapter, not counting like the appendix, is 100 pages.
Oh,
Yeah,
that is
I want it to be
digestible.
like accessible. Yeah.
Right.
And I did put the link to Amazon so you could in the chat so you can track it down and order it if you so wish.
Paperback is all at $20.
Yeah,
Yep.
there you go.
And paperback came out right away. Yeah.
Okay, everyone. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the day.
Are we using the
Bye-bye.
same Zoom for the next call?
No.
No, will you send another Zoom link?
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Jennifer.